Dear participants, hi. Welcome to the 28th Science and Society meeting organized by Istanbul Commerce University. This is Professor Dr. Tuğba Karabulut. And today we have a very important guest, Professor Dr. Rita Mcgrath'ı from Colombia University, and she will be talking about entrepreneurship, innovation, and strategy in the new era. Welcome, Professor Mcgrath'ı.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Elçin Hoca is going to make the opening speech. Welcome, Elçin Hoca. So would you like to start?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Karabulut, first of all, for this webinar. Now we have a very well-known professor now in our today's webinar, in our Science and Society meeting. Professor Mcgrath, if we start to introduce her, we need another webinar, I think, because she's one of the well-known writer of bestseller books, and she has so many studies on entrepreneurship and strategy, innovation and strategy. All of us know her name while we hear her name, we read her books and her articles. Now we have the opportunity to listen from her mouth in this webinar. First of all, thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation. As we know, if you are a student in business administration or business faculty, or if you are studying, if you are a lecturer, if you are an academician studying on entrepreneurship, most probably you are studying on her books, you read her books and have the opportunity to read her articles. One of the most important thing in this field is to select this way how to go for growth, and how to choose the strategy in uncertain circumstances. And she has so many she has theories on this field. Thank you very much for being with us. I'll not tell so much things because we want to hear from your mouth. We want to listen to you. It's a great pleasure for us. For growth, and how to choose the strategy. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Elçin Hoca. So welcome again, Professor Mcgrath'ı. Recently you just published a new book, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. So what can you tell us about this new book?
Well, it was well-timed. It came out right before the pandemic struck and shut everything down. So I define a strategic inflection point as something typically in the environment that creates a 10x shift of some kind. So it allows things to happen 10 times faster, 10 times more inexpensively, 10 times better, but they don't happen overnight. And that's really the opportunity that I describe in the book, which is if you see the weak signals early, you can ride the inflection point to greater success. And of course, if you miss them, then that can lead your business into decline.
Thank you. So what does the term entrepreneurial mindset mean, and what is the role of it for leaders who are in uncertain environments?
Well, the entrepreneurial mindset was my first book, actually, and it was describing how corporations could learn from the experiences of what we call habitual entrepreneurs, so people that have started many businesses, because a one-time success may or may not tell you anything about the process used to achieve that success, because you could have just gotten lucky. Whereas somebody who started many businesses has now codified that into a system. And why companies need to care about that is that if you think about the lifespan of a competitive advantage, in many cases, it's getting shorter and shorter. And so as a company, what you need to be doing is creating multiple competitive advantages so that when one older one has declined, that you have a newer one to replace it with, or else your organization will itself go into decline. So it was really teaching organizations how to behave like habitual entrepreneurs.
Okay. Could you please define entrepreneurial failure? How can entrepreneurs can avoid it?
Entrepreneurial
Failure.
failure?
Failure.
Yeah, well, so I think the thing that entrepreneurs do is they worry a lot less about the rate of failing. So they're very comfortable with high failure rates because each failure costs them very little, right? So what you want is low cost, fast, quick failures, which are really not failures. They're more like experiments or tests, right? And so what you want to be doing is doing a lot of experimentation and a lot of learning before you make big resource commitments. So the ones that fail where it's a disaster, right? Those are the ones that have spent a lot of money, usually based on assumptions that they have not validated. And then when it does have a failure, then it's a catastrophe.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, we can give the floor to our professors. Yeah, Pınar Hoca, would you like to ask a question? Your voice is not coming. Voice is not coming. Yeah.
Okay. Hello. I am also very interested in your field about entrepreneurship and innovation, and also how the innovative capacity is possible to build, and what does it mean for a company?
So I think, a myth about entrepreneurship in companies is that it's this wild and crazy, undisciplined process that, only people like Steve Jobs can figure out. Instead, it's a discipline. It's a discipline that can be learned. And so for a large organization to develop an innovation proficiency, what that means is they have three processes that they put into place. So the first process is getting great ideas. So how do you get a steady flow of new ideas from across the organization? Then you need an incubation process, which is going to take those ideas and transform them into something that could potentially come to market, right? So it's incubating the ideas. And then it's accelerating the new business to take its place with the large businesses that existed before. And to do that, you need to bring its practices up to market grade levels. So you need to bring in legal, and you need to bring in accounting and operations and quality and procurement and all those things. And so companies that do this well have realized how to do each of these three things. So getting great ideas, incubating those ideas, and then accelerating them into the marketplace.
Thank you for your answer. And thank you for your contributions.
Çiğdem Hoca, would you like to ask a question? First, I'm giving the floor to the female professors. Çiğdem Hoca, would you like to ask something?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Karabulut. Professor Mcgrath, I saw in your CV that you also have some experience in the IT sector and also in political arena, and you also were experienced in some startups. So I just want to ask you how you made the decision to enter academia after these different paths.
Well, so I started my career in the public service as you've probably seen on my resume. And the brilliant thing about public sector jobs when you're a young person is you get given, if you're any good at all, you get given a tremendous amount of responsibility. And so your career trajectory just goes like, straight up for some time. But then you reach a certain level where you really can't see much progress. You're going to be basically at the same level for the rest of your career, and there's not much opportunity for growth in many cases. And so my husband and I had a big discussion about it. Now, to put it in context, back then, business schools were just booming. The number of MBA programs, the number of students enrolled in those programs was really growing very substantially. And in American business schools, there was a big move to make sure that the faculty that were in those schools were actually PhD trained, so that they were researchers, not practitioners who would come in and tell war stories, but really, scholars who would be trained to do these things. And so there was a huge demand. And so my husband and I talked it over, and we basically said, look, if you get into a top school, you've always loved research. My parents were both scientists. So, you've always loved research. You've always loved writing. You've always liked to teach, to be with other people. So if you get into a really good school, it's worth doing. So I applied. I was admitted to the Wharton School, which was in Pennsylvania, and that's where I went. So that was the thought process. And if it hadn't been academia, I'm not sure what else it would have been, but there were a number of different choices that I was mulling over at the time.
This is great. And I just want to ask what your bachelor degree was.
My bachelor's was in political science, and I did a master's in public policy.
Mm-hmm. And can I also ask your parents' areas of interest?
Oh, they were scientists. So my mother was a microbiologist, and a brilliant one, absolutely brilliant. She did work on what would later be recognized with a Nobel Prize as self-repairing DNA. So she was part of the research. Yeah, she was part of the research group that did that at Yale, very, very early on in that research stream. But eventually, they won a Nobel Prize for it. And my father was an organic chemist, so he had over 100 patents to his name, very well regarded in his field. He was the co-founder of a global conference, the Selenium and Tellurium Conference, which continues to be held every year rather. And he was really one of the leaders of that specialty. He wrote the initial textbook on selenium and tellurium chemistry.
That is so nice to hear. And we are really honored to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Çiğdem Hoca. And Murat Hoca, would you like to ask a question?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Professor. It is a really great honor to be with you and having very impressive ideas related with the business and entrepreneurship. And Professor, I would like to get your perspective about, nowadays we are discussing also in our lecture the ESG development, like environment, social impact of the entrepreneurial structure and the governance. So I would like to learn these developments, which is the exogenous effect, the opportunity recognition of the entrepreneurship or entrepreneurs. How will this affect the new generation of the entrepreneurs in the business life, and if it is also critical for the new type of the company structure or business structure, and so. If you can share your opinions about this topic, I will be very appreciative about it. Thank you.
So I think William Baumol years ago talked about the allocation of entrepreneurial talent in a society. And he said, depending on the structure of incentives, entrepreneurial talent can be directed towards productive activity. So you create new value, you create new wealth. It can be directed towards unproductive activity. And he would put in that class, like investment advisors, right? You're just moving money around, moving capital around. You're not really creating new wealth. Or it can be channeled into destructive behavior, depending on the structure of incentives. And one of the problems I see with the way that we're thinking about ESG goals right now is we haven't really tackled the incentive problem. Which is that, capitalism responds to incentive structures. So if I'm going to lose money if I pollute, I'm going to have a much stronger interest in not polluting than if I make money because I'm polluting. And I think that's where we have not really done a very good job of saying, let's reflect the true cost of environmental damage in what we ask companies to pay. And if we did that, you had more of a price mechanism response. You would have much more effective action, in my opinion, and you'd have entrepreneurs incentivized to operate in that area. Right now, it seems to be much more of a thing companies are talking about. It's a thing that you have to have your ESG committee and your ESG commitments and all that. But it's not really. I don't think it's real. I think it's not responding to a price mechanism. where if you really meant it, the governments of the world really meant it, they would design the rules so that the true costs of inflicting damage on the environment were borne by those that did that. And we don't have that situation right now. So I think we will, because the alternative is catastrophic. But I think the lack of a price mechanism is one of the reasons that ESG goals are so difficult to reach.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Osman Hoca, would you like to ask a question? He is in the also field of HR and he is our associate professor. Thank you, Murat Hoca. Osman Hoca, are you available? So he has many books actually.
Yes. Professor Mcgrath, welcome. What's the role of entrepreneurs in the companies or in general leaders in order to gain sustainable competitive advantage?
Well, I think you can build sustainable competitive advantages. I think it's more common, though, that you have an advantage which has a life cycle. So the role of the internal entrepreneur is to create innovations that they can then scale, that become the next generation competitive advantage. And then you exploit that for a while. But then eventually, technologies change or something happens that shifts the environment and the advantage goes into erosion. So the role of the internal entrepreneur is to continuously create those new innovations, which can become the foundation for a future competitive advantage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Osman Hoca, and thank you, Professor Mcgrath. And always, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Professor, once again. Professor, I have one question there. What do you think, what is the role of strategy for companies, especially under the condition of uncertainty? So what is the role of strategy? What do you think for companies under the condition of uncertainty? Thank you, Professor.
What's the role of strategy?
Yes, yes, Professor, strategy.
Yeah. So I think strategy actually becomes even more important in uncertain circumstances, because what strategy does is it creates choice conditions, right? It says, here's our strategy. Here's what we hope to accomplish. And it lessens the burden of uncertainty because it helps you focus your attention on what you've thought about as really important factors. So I think it provides a choice framework. It provides a structure for people to move forward. It gives you clarity about what should I be worrying about? What should I not be worrying about? And so in a strange way, strategy actually helps you clarify and make choices without having to bear the burden of all that uncertainty.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks a lot.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Always. Mariam, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for this. Professor Mcgrath, I will continue from Awais' question. I want to ask you about the rules of technology and innovation for the company under condition of uncertainty.
The role of technology and competition?
Yeah, innovation and technology.
Oh, so the way I see it is if you think of a company, right, and you look at the activities that are involved in that company, activities can have varying levels of uncertainty. So where uncertainty is low, you can think of that as your core business, right? And innovation and technology in that space makes your core business healthy. It keeps it healthy, right? So, moving your software infrastructure to the cloud, involving AI in certain decision-making things, automating certain processes, those are all innovative, but you know who you're doing it for, and by and large, you know how to do them. If you think of the next level up of uncertainty, now you're in the world of what I call new platforms, which are candidates to be part of your next generation core. So if you think about something like Amazon Web Services for Amazon, the company up until that point had been pretty much a retailer, a middle man between different kinds of buyers and sellers. And they invented the Amazon technology for themselves because they needed a very flexible, extensible tech infrastructure. And then they had the idea that maybe somebody else had the same problems they did and would like to buy this as a service kind of software. And so they built that up as a whole new platform for growth to go alongside the existing retail business that they had. So that's a new platform. Now, when we get into high uncertainty on either the dimension of technology or the dimension of markets, now I would argue you're in the world of options, where an option is a small investment you make today that buys you the right, but not the obligation to make a subsequent choice. So it's opening up a future space for you. And so when you think about innovation and technology out in the options world, you're making investments where you don't really know what the payback is going to be or what the return is eventually going to be, but you have a suspicion that making that investment will allow you to access a big opportunity space. And I think that's where, you know, the more cutting edge technology and innovation choices are made. They're really opening up future areas for growth and development.
Thank you so much for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And actually, we received a question from YouTube. And they ask, okay, thank you, Professor Dr. Mcgrath. As you are an expert in strategy and innovation, what roles can entrepreneurs play in fighting with climate change issues with their innovations?
Well, there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity going on with respect to climate change. So there are projects on everything from solar power to better batteries to using the oceans, you know, motion to produce energy, to creating businesses that do clean water. But I'll come back to my earlier point, which is if you don't have a structure of incentives that allows these entrepreneurs to, you know, get investment, build their companies, and have either a successful growth path or a successful exit, people are not going to be, by and large, incented to go into those areas. And what you then end up with is usually it's kind of a government regime, which does not always produce the best results when it comes to what kind of businesses we want to see started and which kind grow. So to me, you'd be better off sort of realigning your pricing structure to reflect the true costs to all of us of the ability to pollute. And if you think of a framework that would be suitable for this, in the United States, the government basically said there's a thing called the Clean Air Act. And what they said was, you know, having lead in the air was bad. So we're going to have unleaded gasoline. They went to other kinds of polluters and they said, you're going to have to put cleaners on your, you know, on your chimneys that are producing dust. They went to other folks, but there was a broad alignment that the cost of individual companies being allowed to pollute was collectively too high. Right. And so you really need to go back to those aligned incentives before entrepreneurs are going to be able to work their magic around creating solutions for climate change.
Okay, thank you. And do you think entrepreneurs should have different approach than managers in this new era?
Well, you know, it's the spectrum, right? I mean, some managers are also very entrepreneurial in the sense of always looking for opportunities, always being curious, experimenting, trying out new things, but they're also good managers. And you can have managers who are just really good at running that steady state operations, but they don't really understand anything about innovation or transformation. And then you have entrepreneurs who are great at just coming up with new stuff, but don't ask them to manage anything. So I think there are different skill sets that different kinds of leaders deploy in different circumstances.
Okay, another question. What would be the new opportunities for entrepreneurs, international entrepreneurs, and companies in this era? What kind of sectors they can enter? What kind of new products can they develop? You know, maybe in different sectors in this post-COVID era.
There's an infinite number of new things that could be developed. I think when you look at any sector that has had very little change, there's plenty of opportunity for entrepreneurship. So in food and agriculture, for example, you know, we can't feed the planet well on existing technology. So we're going to have to get a lot smarter about, you know, smart farming, perhaps things like artificial meat, that don't require the kind of resource intensive stuff. Clearly in the energy sector, that's going through a huge transition. And anytime you've got a sector that's massively in transition, I think healthcare, education, these are all very traditional sectors that have not enjoyed a great deal of change. And I think the inflection points going through those areas are changing the structure of the barriers, and that always creates an entrepreneurial opportunity.
Okay. Yeah. And what might be your suggestions for today's business leaders? What should they focus on to succeed?
Well, I think with business leaders, there's always a balance, right? So I think you need to balance the interests of your customers, your employees, and your other stakeholders, of whom investors are certainly one. But part of the skill, right, of being a leader is you can't really control an organization, you have to influence it. And I think that you have to be kind of clear on what your strategy is, where we're trying to get to, what are our goals, what would good look like, and then use the mechanisms at your disposal to influence the organization to behave in such a way that's going to get you to those goals. I think that's really the challenge.
Yeah, and also I realized that you're teaching about agile organizations, right? What might be the basic characteristics for agile organizations, and how can they develop in this new era?
The basic
characteristics.
Practice.
Characteristics of the agile organizations, because it's a very popular term.
Sure. So with an agile organization, the hallmarks of it are you're getting rid of layers of bureaucracy. And what allows you to do that is technology. So you can have teams that are staffed with all the functions that they need to get something done. So instead of having functional silos, you've got engineering and accounting and marketing and all the different functions together. What you've got is teams that have all the functions inside them. And what technology allows you to do then is once the team has a clear goal, the team works on nothing but that goal for a sprint, right? Which is 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks of activity, during which time the team very closely collaborates on getting that one thing done. And so what it's doing is it's taking work that in many companies is organized sequentially, and it's making it go in parallel so that you're increasing the speed with which you can do things. Because rather than having to say, wait for another department to respond or hang around while somebody's not getting back to you on a decision, right within your team, you have the ability to make choices and make decisions and bring something to a conclusion. So this also has important implications for learning, because these small agile teams can try something out, learn from it, try it again, get better, learn from it, try again. And so you're improving capability even as you're doing your learning as a small team. So I think it's a really powerful construct. And I do think that we'll see firms that are able to be organized in a more agile way will eventually develop a competitive advantage over firms that still rely on bureaucracy and managers telling people what to do and that kind of thing. It's a very different way of working.
Okay, thank you. And also you're teaching about digital world, and how can companies succeed for transformation to be a digital company? What could be your suggestions for the companies to succeed in digital transformation?
Well, don't try to do it all at once would be the first suggestion. Big digital projects are almost always doomed. I mean, that's the norm. They don't work. So what I would suggest is get clarity around what good would look like for digital. So, what's the driving feature? So, for example, at DBS, which is one of Singapore's biggest banks, they said, really what customers want from us is to be invisible, right? They'd like to get their banking, their finance, all those things done with as little friction as possible. So their overarching strategy for digital was, let's take out frictions. And so what they did was they really looked at the customer's experience and journey with them and took out frictions, but they didn't do it like in a huge big bang. They said, okay, if we make a customer, let's say, log on twice before they can do a transaction, can we reduce that to 1 log on? If we make a customer fill out 6 forms, could we reduce it to 1 form? And so just kind of very systematically working through the customer's experience so that they were able to remove these frictions, against this larger vision of becoming much more invisible in terms of delivering the customer experience.
Okay, what do you think about artificial intelligence also in different sectors? Do you think that will they be used more extensively in the future?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, artificial intelligence is a very interesting area, right? Because what it's doing is it's taking a lot of rote decisions that were made on the basis of rules, and it's making them much faster and with much better data. So for example, here in the United States, we have a startup called Stratify, which is using artificial intelligence to change the way that they make credit decisions for banks. So as an example, if you were to emigrate here to the United States and you needed to get a mortgage on a house, it would be very, very difficult because you would have no credit history in the United States. And all the mortgage lenders really look to those credit scores to make a decision about how risky you are and all that. Whereas this company Stratify is able to use data from different streams of information about you. So information from your home country, information about how you behave since you lived here, information about whatever, and they back up their recommendation for who should get credit with all this other data. So what it's doing in a way that would be too expensive to do with human beings, it's able to create this massive kind of question engine, which allows banks to make decisions about people that previously they would have just rejected because they don't have the information. So that's the kind of application I think we'll see in AI. Now, what you have to remember with AI is that the AI is only as good as the data sets it's trained on. And so if you're trying to use AI in a new environment, which you haven't taught it about, it's not going to be particularly helpful. And it's probably going to give you a lot of wrong answers. And we forget that, right? We think AI, AI. But, if the database is a database of, I'll make this up, workers in Rhode Island, and the application is people in the Philippines, I would be very dubious about recommendations from the one place applying to the other because there's such different kinds of populations you're trying to look at.
Okay, yeah. And which areas do you think strategy and management researchers should focus on in this era, especially? Just open our vision. So
well,
what do you say?
I think, I think our field suffers from asking questions that we can answer with big data sets rather than asking questions that are really important sometimes. And so I think really important questions like, how do we design effective price measures in capitalism, right? How do we think about the structure of incentives would be a really great question to think about, because if you think about it, right, the pricing mechanisms in an economy determine how the markets are going to function in that economy and how you behave as an organization. What your strategy is, in fact, is going to be legitimized or not by the rules in play in the economy. So there's a whole area of how do we make sure that we set the rules under which capitalism operates so that it delivers a result that is, a good one for as many people as possible. So that's kind of a whole area. I think there's another whole area of strategy under uncertainty, which is really under researched. I think the connection between talent and strategy execution is often not really explored. We sort of leave talent to OB, and then we look at strategy, and that comes from economics, and that's about economic decision making. We don't see much integration of the two.
Okay. So do you think undergraduate and graduate education in the field of strategy and management will change in the near future?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've been saying this for a long time. What you're going to see, and this isn't just strategy, this is across all of higher education, you're going to start to see credentialing at the level of the skill or the course rather than the level of the university. So right now, think of us like a compact disc, right? And as a student, if you want to buy a degree, if you want to buy, say, expertise in civil engineering, right? You have to buy the whole degree. So you have to go to the school, you have to take courses only from their professors and so forth. But let's imagine that instead of a CD, you had the ability to buy one song. Well, what happens to the CD? The CD gets unbundled. And what happens is, the courses, the professors, the credits that are deemed to be useful are the ones that are going to be purchased, and the ones that are deemed to be of less interest are not going to be. And so you'll see that unbundling. And I think that's going to have a dramatic effect on how universities conduct their business, because once I don't need that degree to prove that I have a skill, the degree, the stranglehold the degree has disappears.
Okay. So yeah. So what might be your suggestions for the, rectors, vice rectors? How should they manage their universities in this new era, especially when you look at from the strategy perspective?
Well, I think they've got to start experimenting with new models, right? Most of academia has a very rigid model that hasn't changed in a long, long time. And, I would take inspiration from schools like Arizona State University. Their president is very visionary and has really talked about the fifth wave in certainly American higher education, and he lists how they fit into subsequent waves. So I think another great example is Southern New Hampshire University, which is completely reimagined, both its in-person and its online training programs. So I think I would be inclined to really look at the ones that are doing the experiments, what's going on, who's trying things. In education, a really interesting guide to follow is a guy named Michael Horn, who has done a lot of very smart thinking about, where is higher education going, what makes it valuable or not, and so forth. So I think there's some very interesting experiments going on. I think when I look at my sort of counterparts in higher ed, unfortunately, a lot of the activity is kind of to pretend that the change isn't happening, or if they do see it happening, to try to put it back, in the box, and that's not going to work, right? Certainly in the United States, our higher education system doesn't produce great outcomes. Students, graduate with massive amounts of debt, which holds them back in life. So it's a very expensive thing. And then the jobs that they get are not necessarily worth going through all that. So, we have a mismatch between what higher ed thinks it's doing and what our society and workforce need.
Okay, and one final question. What might be the effects of remote working for the strategy, for the management of the companies?
Well, we're going to have to be more deliberate about, when people get together and for what, right? So I think we're going to be very conscious of what's work I can do as an individual contributor, right? So if I'm reviewing patents all day long, right? And my job is sitting at a desk, reading a patent very carefully and marking it up for any clarification or questions. That's an individual contributor job. And that could be done remote, right? There's no reason you have to be with lots of other people also reading patents to do that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have work that I think has to be done with teams and collaborations. And that would be, creative work, problem solving work, work that involves building trust, work that involves novel solutions. And I wouldn't be surprised if what we start to see emerging is much greater clarity on the part of companies about, okay, here's a chunk of time we're going to use for creative problem solving, new kinds of work. And then once that's done, you can kind of go off and work wherever you want to follow up, to do the individual contributor work needed to bring these things to life. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see sort of a peak of in-person and then sort of a decline. I do think we've learned that a lot of what employers assumed, which is that workers have to be in the office to be productive. I think that's been discovered to be a bit of a myth, that, we've learned we can be very productive and not in the office. And for a lot of people, not having to commute, not having to deal with perhaps unpleasant colleagues, not having to endure all the frictions, has been revelatory. People have now learned to work this way. And so why would they go back to, a long commute and sitting in an office all day long?
Okay, because nowadays you're having Chidem Hoca, would you like to ask a question? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Professor Mcgrath, I know that you had experience with 2 different startups. So if you go back and reflect on that experience, would you do anything different?
Well, they weren't fatal. I didn't die. I learned a lot of painful lessons, which I think, have stood me in good stead subsequently. So I'll give you an example. When my first startup was a company in the political arena. So we did the really unglamorous part of politics. So printing brochures and getting mailings out and doing poster campaigns and that kind of thing, right? And we did really well the first year, so well that we were going into the second year thinking this is going to be great. But we made the kind of stupid mistake that you make when you're very young and you don't know what you're doing, which is that we forgot elections don't happen every year. So the year 2, we're kind of looking at each other going, where is everybody? And so that turned into a business that was doing typing, word processing, printing, that kind of thing. And then I realized I really was interested in doing that. So it was painful at the time. I think it taught me, a lot about what it does mean to have a failure, what it does mean to find out how wrong about the dangers of making assumptions and not really thinking things through. But it was, as they like to say, a very learning-rich experience, and nobody died. It was in the long run, it worked out okay.
Thank you very much. And by the way, can you also share your view about social entrepreneurship a little?
Well, social entrepreneurship is a really interesting corner of the field, because what you're trying to do with social entrepreneurship is solve for two outcomes simultaneously. So probably the most famous is Muhammad Yunus's Grameen Bank. And what he was trying to solve for was, how do you break this cycle where particularly women in rural parts of India were trapped in this cycle of needing to borrow money to fund, a bit of a business that they might be doing, but never getting enough critical mass that they could actually pay off their debtors and move on. And what he realized was, that these were groups largely of women. So he would give the group of them a loan, and each of the women would support, say, the one woman whose business was going to be supported by this. And she, in turn, when she was able to break through, get out of that cycle, would then give that money back, and that money would then be recycled. And these kind of micro enterprises became the foundation for Grameen's substantial economic success. So social entrepreneurship is very interesting, because you're actually trying to solve two problems. You're trying to be financially solvent, and secure, but you're also trying to get a change, to have impact in some kind of social condition. But I think it's an interesting thing that we're hearing a lot more about now.
Thank you very much.
I'm actually interested in corporate entrepreneurship. And do you think that corporate entrepreneurship can really trigger innovation in the companies?
Do I think that corporate entrepreneurship does what?
Can trigger the innovation in the companies?
Oh,
yeah. And how can companies, accelerate corporate entrepreneurship for making better innovations?
Well, you talk about starting a company. I started a company to try to help do that. And it's called Belize, B-A-L-I-Z-E. And what we do at Belize is we have some advisory to sort of help you get the right practices and programs in place. We have tools that have come out of my research, which help you actually do things. So here's a tool to help you assess your team effectiveness. Here's a tool to help you figure out where your innovations are getting stuck, those kind of things. And then we've also got a series of online and live online learning modules, which are going to help people learn how to do certain skills, right? So the concept is those three things really work together to help you build capability. And my vision for it is very different from most consultancies, because what I want to do is help companies build that capability. And once they've learned how to do it, then I go away, and they can carry on with innovating on their own. And back to what I said earlier on, we've learned now that innovation is not some kind of dark art. It's a discipline that can be practiced. And that's what I really think we want to bring to life with the Belize concept.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your ideas. We really enjoyed.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for accepting our invitation to participate. And we would like to see you in Istanbul in our university whenever you want. And Elçin Hoca will make the closing speech. Elçin Hoca, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. And oops, my connection is not so good. Professor Mcgrath, thank you very much for being with us, for accepting our invitation. And also, I also especially want to thank you for sharing your ideas and contributions to the business field with our students and with us also as managers. Thank you very much. I hope also we can see you face to face. We can have a meeting face to face in Istanbul.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a lovely evening.
You too. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.